Hi, welcome to theAnalysis-news. I'm Paul J. Be back in just a few seconds with Boris Kagarlitsky. We're going to talk more about Russia and the invasion of Ukraine. Please don't forget to subscribe if you're on YouTube, to hit the donate button. Come on over to the website. It's, by the way, for people watching on YouTube, the website's by far a better place to watch because there is some material there that doesn't appear on YouTube. For example, text articles and other things. Be back in just a few seconds. The last time I interviewed Boris Kagarlitsky, there was a lot of response that Boris wasn't emphasizing enough or denouncing enough the role of NATO in what many people describe as a provocation of Russia into invading Ukraine. They talk about the NATOization of Ukraine in terms of the extent to which Ukraine was armed by the US and Europe prior to the invasion. And they say even though it's not a formal member of NATO and can't trigger Article 5 and the armed defense of Ukraine by NATO, it comes right up to the edge of that. And that was a provocation that eventually, after many attempts to negotiate this by Putin's government, Putin was essentially forced or provoked into this invasion. That's certainly what Russia says itself. Putin has said this, his foreign ministers and others have said it. And there's people on the left, especially in the global south, you can hear this argument made. So I wanted to start the interview by giving Boris a chance to respond to that. So once again, Boris Kagarlitsky, he's a well-known commentator on Russian politics and society. Boris was a deputy to the Moscow City Soviet between 1990 and 1993, during which time he was a member of the executive of the Socialist Party of Russia. He's co-founder of the Party of Labor and advisor to the chairperson of the Federation of Independent Trade Unions of Russia. Previously, he was a student of art criticism and was imprisoned for 2 years for anti-Soviet activities. Boris's books include Empire of the Periphery, Russia and the World System, also Russia under Yeltsin and Putin, Neoliberal Autocracy, and New Realism, New Barbarism, The Crisis of Capitalism. In 2021, Kagarlitsky was sentenced to 10 days in jail for sharing content on social media, promoting unpermitted protests by the Communist Party against the results of then Russia's recent parliamentary elections. Boris has the distinction of having been put in jail by just about every government for the last few decades. He's currently a professor at Moscow Higher School for Social and Economic Sciences and editor of Rabkor, a daily Russian journal and YouTube channel of left-wing debate. And he joins us from Moscow. Thanks very much for joining us again, Boris.
Great seeing you, Paul.
So there are many comments on our website, YouTube, and such that thought you were underestimating the role of NATO and the Americans in provoking this. And I would say that there's two different categories of this. Provoking the invasion because of the arming of Ukraine, the talk of certainly including Ukraine in the EU, and talk about including it in NATO, although I think it should have been obvious to everybody that there was no way they were going to get consensus amongst NATO countries to include Ukraine in NATO. At the same time, there was a lot of arming of Ukraine prior to the invasion. So how do you assess, now before I ask the question, I just advise everyone, go back and watch part 1 if you haven't. Because Boris did address this question to a large extent, essentially saying that the invasion was driven by domestic politics and increasing unpopularity of both the Putin government and the Russian oligarchy. But that said, Boris, how do you assess the role of NATO and the West in the Ukrainian war?
Well, first of all, I think there is a major confusion here. Because if I'm saying that NATO didn't play a major role in kind of launching and provoking this particular conflict, it doesn't mean I'm saying anything positive about NATO, because these are two different things. NATO plays definitely a very negative role in Europe and in the world, in the sense that it is a factor of global militarization. And in that sense, definitely we have to oppose NATO. But the problem is not here. The problem is elsewhere. The problem is to analyze particular facts which led to this particular conflict. And here the picture is very different because, yes, NATO expansion could have been seen as a major challenge to Russian security. And by the way, before the war, for a very long period of time, once I was interviewed by foreign journalists, I kept saying that there were Russian security concerns which should have been taken seriously. However, the irony is that Russian government didn't take these concerns seriously. Listen, the most interesting point here, because uh, they didn't really react strongly, except uh, just making some formal statements to the expansion of NATO into the Baltic republics, for example, which is something technically much more serious than the negotiations about Ukraine, because in the Baltic republics, among other things, not only were kind of involved in the NATO alliance, but they were also not following the rules of the European Union, which they joined. For example, the Russian minority in Latvia and Estonia never managed to get proper rights, which should have been guaranteed according to the documents of the European Union. The European Union didn't do much about it. Neither did Russia, by the way. Russia never tried to do anything seriously at the European level to press, to push these countries to respect.
Boris, what could they have done they didn't do?
For example, they should have negotiated that with the European Union. They should have discussed these issues at the European level, at the level of the European Parliament, European, what's the term? European Parliamentary Assembly, for example, which Russia was a member. Put that as a major issue for the public international debate and so on. It was never done at that level. Actually, it's very interesting. They never used the huge amount of money which they kind of spent on supporting politicians like Marine Le Pen and other far-right politicians, for example, to support Russian cultural activities in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. For example, I had my own experience when I tried to put forward, together with a few colleagues, a project of sending Russian books to Latvian, Estonian, and Lithuanian libraries, which were quite ready to accept these books. Books on political science, books translated from English or German or French into Russian. And so to support Russian cultural activities and Russian cultural life in these countries, that was rejected by Russian government institutions because they said definitely that they were not interested. And in private, they said, there is no way we can steal money out of this project. So the project is not efficient from the point of view of those corrupt officials who considered every project from the point of view how much money could have been stolen from this project. So there was total indifference to the Russian cultural life in these countries. Like sometimes you can send some kind of I don't know, a group of Cossack dancers to Latvia, just also to show that there was some cultural presence. But once there was any kind of cultural issue which was seriously important for these communities, Russian officials completely rejected it. The same thing.
But they did issue some pretty strong statements in the months leading up before the invasion about the eastward expansion of NATO, where they made demands about that Ukraine shouldn't be part of NATO. They also wanted some demilitarization of even some of the other countries that were already in NATO.
But actually, these statements by Putin and his people were themselves more like provocations, but rather more like an attempt to prepare the excuses for their activities, which they already planned. You see, speaking about Ukraine, again, we have to see two different things. One thing is that what kind of state do we have in Ukraine currently? And Ukrainian state is not the kind of democracy as it is presented in the West. It's a state which represses, for example, its leftist groups, the state which really continues repressing leftists. Like, for example, Dmitry Jangirov, a good friend of mine, is now under arrest in Kiev. And there are plenty of reasons for us to be very critical about the Ukrainian state. But it doesn't change the fact that it was Putin's Russian army which attacked Ukraine and not the other way round. Full stop.
Okay, let me ask, shouldn't the Ukrainian government have simply outright declared neutrality before the invasion, especially given the fact they were never going to get into NATO anyway? Why not just say so? And even if it was just an excuse, at least take that excuse away.
Actually, there was a lot of debate inside of Ukraine about it. And there were voices which were saying exactly this inside Ukrainian political sphere and even inside the current Ukrainian government. If you follow what was discussed and what was debated within Ukrainian political class, this is exactly the issue. And why was the pro-NATO the pro-NATO's tendency dominant? For a very simple reason. Russia kept threatening Ukrainian state with invasion publicly almost every day. You just turn on Russian television for years. They were speaking and discussing the future invasion into Ukraine. Imagine you're in a country with a neighbor who is discussing publicly the future aggression against you. Of course, it's quite natural that the ones who speak up for the military buildup are much more popular than those who are speaking in favor of demilitarization and just disarmament and so on and so on. So it's pretty natural. One, in the West or in the global South, people simply do not know what was on Russian television and in Russian state-controlled newspapers, for example, and Ukrainian public and Ukrainian politicians and Ukrainian citizens who all know Russian, half of whom are Russian speakers, they all knew that and they read it and heard that every day. By the way, I remember there was this moment when Ukraine banned Russian television channels from being broadcasted in Ukraine. And after that, there was an opinion poll in Ukraine, and which has shown that the opinion of Russia started getting better after Russian television channels were banned in Ukraine, because these channels were extremely jingoistic. And again, speaking to people in the global South, I should say they probably see that as a struggle against American imperialism or something like that, which has nothing to do with the reality. Because if you hear Russian government propaganda, first of all, it's totally racist. It's like saying that Ukrainians are kind of inferior Russians. The Ukrainians are just people who are genetically inferior. because these are kind of Russians, but spoiled Russians, Russians who are spoiled genetically because of the presence of Tatar or Western or some other genes in their blood and so on. So that's what you get on television. That's what you get daily, that Ukrainian culture doesn't have the right to exist and so on. The very existence of Ukrainian language's culture is an existential threat to the existence of Russia. And it's also very new colonialist in the sense it's like an attempt to pull back a former colony into the empire. Again, I should say it's very much propaganda. It's very much propaganda. I'm not saying that that's the major motivation for the Russian government, because I told you before that the major motivations for the Russian government are domestic. The major motives are domestic. But just imagine you're an Ukrainian and you turn on television or internet or a newspaper, and what you get there is a real wave of aggression, a wave of racist aggression against not only your government or your state, but also your country, your culture, your language, and so on and so on. So, and that explains that within this context, the anti-Russian groups within Ukrainian elite, which are quite reactionary, by the way, had the upper hand. And it also creates their atmosphere within which, for these groups, these reactionary groups, it's getting extremely easy to accuse anyone on the left or anybody who represents even the liberal left or the center left to be kind of Russian agents or spies and so on, because that creates this atmosphere which is totally of the hysteria of their anger and the atmosphere of fear also. But this atmosphere was very much created by the Russian propaganda itself. This is something which has to be understood in the West.
So if one of the objectives of the Russian invasion was supposedly denazification of Ukraine, it sounds like you're saying, if anything, it might have strengthened the Nazification of Ukraine.
Sure, it did. Though, interestingly enough, now the situation in Ukraine is much more complicated, because if you are getting back into the Ukrainian politics, it's becoming much more democratic and pluralistic now, these days, during the war, than it used to be before the war. Why? For a very simple reason. Who is fighting? Who has the weapons? By the way, speaking about the militarization of Ukraine and about weapons being sent to Ukraine, actually, well, this is a huge exaggeration, because there was a lot of weapons sent, but these were mainly weapons which could be used for guerrilla warfare. So like Javelin systems and sometimes Stinger systems, the kind of weapons which used to be sent by Americans to Afghanistan during the Soviet invasion into Afghanistan and so on. So because the West was not planning that Ukrainian army was going to survive the war. They were not expecting Ukraine to survive as a country. They were expecting that Ukraine would be occupied, and then, of course, like in Afghanistan, they would be supplying some kind of guerrilla forces, also creating problems for the Russian troops and so on. That was the Western strategy, which didn't happen because Ukrainian army, which was mainly fighting with its own hardware.
There's a very interesting statistic that supports what you're saying. Prior to 2014, 2015, Ukraine was in the top 10. I think it was 8th or 9th largest arms exporter in the world. But after that, it dropped out of the top 10 arms exporters in the world, not because it was producing less arms, but because the arms were staying in Ukraine and building up the military capacity of the Ukrainian army.
Exactly, that's the point. Ukrainian army was happened to become quite a considerable fighting force, exactly because it was rearming itself massively. So it was not the West which was arming Ukraine, but it was Ukraine which was rearming itself massively. and it was Ukrainian hardware, including, interestingly enough, some high-tech hardware, which happens to be superior to what is produced in Russia, and cheaper, much more effective. And that was a big surprise, both for Russian generals and for Western military experts, that Ukraine happened to become capable of fighting back quite successfully. And then there was a long period of discussion between Ukrainian government and NATO and Western powers about getting proper military hardware, which is arriving to Ukraine just now. So after 4 months of fighting, heavy fighting, after the bombing of Kiev and Kharkov, and after the massacre in Bucha and so on, even 2 months after the massacre in Bucha, Ukraine didn't get much of the hardware it was asking for. So it's not that the West was arming Ukraine massively. On the contrary, the West was quite cynical about probably using Ukraine for its own purposes, but not very much about helping Ukraine. These are different things. Helping Ukraine and using Ukraine are two very different things. But coming back to the issue, I insist, I want to continue. There is a very important issue. What's happening now with the Ukrainian political class and Ukrainian politics in general? Because by the end of February, it was very clear that the nationalists, the ethnic nationalists, the right-wing tendencies within Ukrainian political spectrum were definitely having the upper hand. And it was very clear that Zelensky government was making one concession to them after another concession. So they were really, Zelensky government is not a nationalist government, but it was retreating, systematically retreating on major issues. And now the situation started getting more complex. I'm not saying that it's getting much better. I'm saying it's getting much more complex, much more contradictory, in the sense that there is now a growing force and a force which is more and more vocal, which is supporting the idea of reinventing the Ukrainian state, and reinventing the Ukrainian state on a non-nationalist basis. Why? First of all, why? Second, who are these people? Why is it's very clear. The army which is fighting against Russians is mostly Russian-speaking. The generals, the soldiers, the officers, the heroes of Ukraine, the ones who are presented as the faces of the Ukrainian resistance, most of these people are not only Russian speakers, many of them are ethnic Russians who are proud to be Russians, who say that they're Russians, they're Ukrainian Russians, okay? They keep saying they are Ukrainian Russians. And that changes the situation, because there are not so many heroes who can represent Ukrainian nationalism, with the exception of the Azov regiment in Mariupol, who was really a nationalist regiment.
These are people who are either self-described or described as Nazis, very far right. At least were at the.
They're not Nazis, but they were definitely far right. They were definitely far right. They were as far right as most of the Trumpists. They were very much like Trump supporters.
I mean, a kind of Christian nationalist.
Sure. They were like Trump supporters or Marine Le Pen supporters, definitely. That was definitely a battalion and then a regiment organized by the far right. The problem with them is that most of these people do not speak Ukrainian. They are all so in that sense, even when you see the face of Ukrainian ethnic nationalism, and then then these people appear on the video, and either they speak very poor Ukrainian or they speak Russian. So in that sense, the actual face of the Ukrainian resistance, even when it is presented by the right wing, by the far right, is associated with the Russian-speaking population of the East. So in that sense, one thing that Russian speakers are now armed they're organized and armed. Then you have the so-called territorial defense, территориальная оборона, territorial defense force. This is a kind of public organization, this kind of popular militia organized to fight back against the invasion. Where are these people? They're all in eastern and southern regions of Ukraine. So these forces, armed forces, new armed forces, we have hundreds of thousands of people who either got weapons or got access to weapons. Who are these people? These are Russian speakers. So that changed the balance of forces, because if you take the situation before February 24th, then everybody who was armed and organized were people on the far right, and there were either these volunteer battalions, which were far right and which were, of course, also very much promoting this Ukrainian nationalist agenda. And there were groups from the west of Ukraine who were kind of parachuted to the east just to suppress pro-Russian movements and tendencies there, and who terrorized local population very often. There were people not necessarily from the west, but sometimes from the west, sometimes from the east, but who joined ethnic nationalists and who terrorized local population. Now there is no way you can do it because local population is armed itself. So in that sense, it changed the balance of forces within Ukrainian society massively. So it's a very different society these days. Now coming to the actual voices, who are these people who are speaking in favor of more balanced or more kind of integrative Ukrainian state? Actually, it's very interesting because there are two tendencies developing simultaneously. Because on the one hand, you can see some attempts to cancel Russian culture, to pull down the statues, monuments. There are attempts to introduce new textbooks which represent Russians as existential enemies, very much like Russian textbooks represent Ukraine. So there are similar textbooks introduced in Ukraine also. So you can see this continuing offensive of the far right, which didn't stop. It continues, and it's getting the new levels. But at the very same time, there are people in Kiev close to Zelensky administration, close to the military, who are speaking out publicly against that. And who are these people? First of all, let's see who is the most vocal person. Is
before you get to that, I'm just confused on something here. If much of the far right speaks Russian, then who's enforcing the laws to suppress Russian culture?
That's the biggest irony. Many of these people who do not speak Ukrainian at the same time are supporting their idea of suppressing Russian language for the ideological reasons. Because and then that's exactly that's what Ukraine is about. Because Ukraine is a very special place when you can find people who are denouncing Russian culture and promoting Ukrainian culture, who do not speak proper Ukrainian. They speak terrible Ukrainian, or they don't speak Ukrainian language at all. Then you can see some people who speak perfect Ukrainian, who are very much within the Ukrainian culture, who are coming from Lviv, from the west, from the Ukrainian-speaking west, and who will tell you, well, I have no problems with Russian language. I'm okay with Russian culture. That's fine with me. So it's the language issue is very much an ideological issue. It's not necessarily the actual issue about the language you speak, but it's the language which you consider to be appropriate to express specific political message. And that's very much the contradiction, because again, Zelensky didn't speak Ukrainian language before he became the president. Then he had to learn Ukrainian language, and that's the problem here is that in Ukraine it is considered to be normal. Once you get elected to a top position in the bureaucracy, you have to learn the language, not the other way around. So nobody asks to know the language to get elected, but once you get elected, you have to learn the language.
It's very confusing. All right, you were about to say the voices who are speaking out for a kind of different, a new kind of Ukrainian state.
Okay, so let's look at these voices. So the most prominent voice. So let's speak about these voices. So the most prominent voice is Alexei Arestovich, who is the advisor to Zelensky on the military issues, but who is considered to be the liaison person between the military and the civilian government. And it's interesting because he's a military officer, but also a kind of public intellectual, which is a very rare case. I really, really very much impressed by that, because it's not very often that you get a professional military who is a public intellectual at the same time. And he's really, really quite competent. He speaks about literature. He speaks about history. Sometimes makes mistakes though on history, but he's a Russian speaker, and he appears on the internet, on television, daily, sometimes 3 or 4 times a day, with the current news, with the analysis, and so on. And he is considered now to be the second most popular and most trusted figure in Ukraine, most kind of influential figure in Ukraine. By the way, do you know who's the first one? The first one is the dog called Patron.
What
This dog,
more he's the dog is more popular than Zelensky?
by far, by far.
Whose dog is that?
The dog Patron is a dog which is involved in demining activities with the Ukrainian army. The dog, it appears also on the internet almost daily with the news about demining of the areas which were affected by the military activities. And then in the name of the dog, they report, for example, how dangerous are particular types of mines or shells. And so what you should do when you discover a shell or a mine or some other explosive device anywhere. So the dog also appears on the social media daily, and the dog is now considered to be the most popular character on social media by far. So when they compared the dog Patron with Zelensky and Arestovich, suddenly they discovered that the dog is by far more popular than any of the politicians. So this is, by the way, I think it's very telling. What do you think about politicians also?
Well, I'm sure there's many dogs that would beat most of the American leaders in popularity polls too. But anyway, go ahead. So who is this guy then? What does he stand for?
So Alexei Arestovich is, as I told you before, Alexei Arestovich is the liaison person between the military and the civilian administration. He's also the most popular commentator, human commentator, and putting aside the dog Patron, who's the most popular human commentator on Ukrainian social media, television, and internet. He speaks Russian all the time. His Ukrainian is okay. He can speak Ukrainian. When he makes public statements as an official, he makes these public statements in Ukrainian. But all other statements are made in Russian. And he keeps attacking Ukrainianization almost every day, saying, well, what we need to achieve equality between languages and communities. And unless we accept Russian language as part of Ukraine, we are not going to win this conflict.
All right, so this guy is pushing back against Ukrainianization, and he's a very popular politician and military leader.
Now many people say that he is going to be the next president. His popularity is really skyrocketing. And not only this, not only that he is speaking about that the small Ukrainian culture should embrace the big Russian culture. So that Russia is not only physically bigger. It has a bigger history and a bigger culture, but Ukraine should not reject this culture. It should embrace it and appropriate it and integrate it into the Ukrainian identity.
Within a sovereign Ukraine.
Well, yes, within the sovereign Ukrainian identity. That's the message. Second, interestingly enough, he's very critical of NATO. To some extent, though, blaming NATO for not supporting Ukraine properly, of course, but also very critical of the West. And
so by approaching it the way he is, it helps to unify the Russian and Ukrainian speaking peoples in a war against the Russian invasion.
Yes, by the way, but it's also very typical that every time he speaks about Russia, he says, I'm not speaking about Russia, I'm speaking about Putin, the Putin regime. So we are not fighting against Russia, we are fighting against Putin's regime. So that's also a very interesting statement he keeps repeating time and again. Then, just recently, it was a very scandalous thing because Dmitry Bykov, who is a very well-known Russian writer, very well-known Russian writer who emigrated from Russia, and he recently visited Kiev, and they had a show together with Arestovich. They appeared together on I think on YouTube, and then suddenly they discussed Russian literature and so on and so on, and then suddenly Arestovich said Soviet Union was the best thing which ever happened in Ukrainian history. It was the God's blessing that we were part of the Soviet Union. That was a big scandal, actually, because Ukrainian state tends to say that we have nothing to do with the Soviet Union. We were always oppressed. We were always victims of Stalinism, communism, and so on and so on. Then this guy suddenly says, "Look, Soviet Union was the best episode of our history."
And why does he say that?
Well, because he's undermining the nationalist discourse. He's not a leftist. He's not a leftist. He is systematically, consciously undermining the nationalist discourse.
The far right nationalist.
Yeah,
so let me just to put a pin on this. Zelensky has been backing up, compromising, capitulating to the right nationalists, where this guy is standing up to them.
Exactly. And by the way, he's Belarusian ethnically. She is Belarusian. He's Belarusian, and his father.
Let me go back to this point of Zelensky compromising, capitulating to the far right, because one of the justifications for the Russian invasion was that when Zelensky was elected in the beginning, part of his promise in the election was a peaceful resolution of the Donbass problem, which people thought would have been a negotiation of some kind, a level of autonomy for Donbass. Then there was the Minsk Agreement 1 and 2. And one of the justifications for this invasion that comes from Putin is that, one, Ukraine never implemented the Minsk agreements, which would have given more autonomy to Donbass, and two, that the strengthening of the Ukrainian military forces and the increased militarization of Ukraine, and as we talked about, a lot of that was actually domestic Ukrainian production, but still, that beefing up was actually meant as a preparation for Ukrainian invasion of the independent republics, autonomous republics in Donbass, and thus becomes one of the justifications for the invasion. So is there some truth to all of that?
There is. At least in one sense that Zelensky government was not up to its promises. It was definitely not carrying out what was expected. Not necessarily promised, though, sometimes expected, because certain things were never articulated. But voting for Zelensky, people expected certain things to happen, and they didn't happen. And as I told you before, Zelensky was systematically capitulating to the far right. He was elected by the people who wanted him to stand up against the far right, and he did exactly the opposite. He was retreating and capitulating. And in that sense, Zelensky does share the responsibility for what is happening. Just it's not the equal responsibility. Of course, you should not confuse the one who is responsible for not doing the right thing with somebody who is responsible for doing the wrong thing. You see, this is the big difference. Whatever you say about strengthening of the Ukrainian military force, it was by far weaker than the Russian force. Okay, let's put it differently. Even if we imagine that Ukraine was planning to invade Donetsk and Lugansk, which is not true, but even if we were accepting that kind of claim, it doesn't justify the invasion of Russian army into Ukraine, because what you could do, you could simply send more troops, Russian troops, to protect Lugansk and Donetsk from a possible invasion. Full stop. Actually, Russia had the capacity to protect these territories, and it doesn't mean that the only way to protect these territories was to occupy some other territories. So it's very much the post factum justification, which is very typical for every aggression, for every aggressor. In the last 100 years, it's very typical that most of aggressors are explaining their behavior by saying, well, okay, if we didn't do that, the other side would have done this. But that's not how things are done in the real world. In the real world, if you want somebody to abstain from, say, invading a neighboring country, you should be helping the neighboring country, not attacking the other country, you see? Of course, that's another reason why, for example, voting for the recognition of Donetsk and Lugansk in the Russian parliament itself didn't necessarily lead to a major war. There was still a chance to avoid a major war. One option was to send some troops there just to prevent Ukrainian attack if it were a real danger, which it wasn't. So, actually, there was not much fighting going on along their Lugansk and Donetsk de facto frontier. The number of civilian casualties under Zelensky government was diminishing, that's true, even though there was no real attempt to get some peace settlement or some understanding, mutual understanding with the people in Donetsk and Lugansk. Nevertheless, the actual fighting was decreasing systematically.
Yeah, the OSCE reports confirm that it was diminishing greatly from 2018 on.
Exactly. So the point is that, of course, again, Zelensky didn't use the opportunity he got initially when he got elected, especially in 2019, when there was no reason for Ukrainian public to be so much afraid of the Russian invasion, because it was 5 years after their original crisis in Lugansk and Donetsk, and well, the situation was relatively calm by then. So what could have been done by Zelensky was some kind of move towards reconciliation, some kind of cultural gestures, some kind of people's diplomacy, some kind of attempts to start not necessarily formal negotiations, but at least informal contacts with the other side, showing that their concerns were taken seriously.
Now the United States in the weeks leading up to the invasion, even months, certainly could have, and there were even commentators on some of the talk shows, some of the foreign policy pundits, even coming from the right, who said that there is no way Ukraine's ever going to really be part of NATO. The Biden administration certainly could have said something like that. They could have said, look, everyone knows we're never getting consensus on Ukraine getting into NATO. And the Americans could have taken that off the table. But they didn't, which is one of the arguments that even though it wasn't perhaps, as you're saying, the factor why the Russians invaded, the Americans must have been somewhat pleased with it all in the final analysis, because they could have done something to mitigate the excuses for invasion. And quite the opposite, they seem to help provoke it.
Quite possible. Though I think that the invasion should have happened anyhow, because of the domestic reasons. As I told you before, there were lots of reasons to start some minor war, which happened to become a major war. They didn't expect the war to be so serious, to be so so massive, so long, and so on. They definitely wanted some kind of short operation. But when Putin spoke about a special military operation, I think we have to take it too seriously. I think he was quite honest in the sense that he wanted a short military operation destroying Ukrainian army and Ukrainian state within days or hours, which didn't happen. So that was a major miscalculation. That was a major and fatal mistake. But nevertheless, I don't think that they planned for a major war. They were not ready for a major long-term war. But let's get back to the original issue. What I'm saying is that now the situation changed. Now the situation changed that within the Ukrainian military, there is a growing tendency towards reshaping, rearranging the Ukrainian state. So in that sense, the military now in Ukraine became heroes, and they became popular, and they are now going to play a major political role. That's why it's very interesting that the figure of Arestovich is emerging.
But let me get back to this because I think it's an important point, at least certainly for the Western audiences. United States could have done more
definitely
to prevent this, and quite the contrary. They actually seem to egg it on, and now we can see why, perhaps because they must be smiling ear to ear, except. And I want to do this more in the next interview we do, because the economic sanctions are affecting the West, I think, far more than the West ever expected. But that said, the Americans certainly hoped and thought this would weaken and perhaps become the overthrow of Putin. And they didn't care how many Ukrainians died in the course of all this.
Well, first of all, we have to understand there are no good guys in this story. There are no good guys among American politicians, at least among the top American politicians. And there are no good guys among Russian or Ukrainian top politicians.
Yeah, this is a fight amongst oligarchs.
Yes, within capitalism, within the bourgeoisie, among the oligarchs, and so on. So that's how it is. That's the kind of world we are in. We don't have the positive hero. Even when I'm speaking about Arestovich with a lot of admiration, because he's making statements which really are game-changing, we should know that Arestovich is also part of this elite, and very much part of this milieu, which is running the Ukraine these days. But it's very interesting that he is moving towards this kind of agenda, or this kind of integrationist agenda.
But do you not think the Americans saw the opportunity for what people describe as another Afghanistan, of sucking the Soviets into Afghanistan? We're going to suck the Russians into Ukraine.
That was probably, I don't know much about what was happening in Washington. I'm sure that was at least part of the issue. At least that was an option which they considered to be quite okay for them.
And let me say, when I say that, Putin has the choice not to be sucked in. It's not like he's ignorant of what the plans on the other side are.
They didn't care. I think they didn't care. Nobody cared that much about Ukraine. You see, that's the problem. Nobody cared about Ukrainians. Putin's team was pretty sure that they were going to defeat Ukraine very fast, and they didn't care about a possible guerrilla war in Ukraine, because they probably thought of maybe establishing some kind of puppet government there and then retreating, so that Ukrainians would fight each other later after the war. And by the way, that's very much part of the Ukrainian tradition itself. If you look at the Ukrainian history, you see there was not so much fighting against Russians. There was a lot of fighting among the Ukrainians. with, say, Russians backing one side against another, and so on. That was very much part of their understanding I mean, Russia's leaders' understanding of the situation, which was totally erroneous. It was a miscalculation. But now we have a different situation. In Ukraine, we have a different situation in Russia. And Russia society is now acknowledging, the society, not the government, the society is acknowledging that the war is not going to be won. That's the essential thing. Especially in the last days, if you're following Russian social media, what you discover is the growing awareness of the fact that the war is not going to end up positively, victoriously. Now we have the recent opinion poll with an increasing number of people saying that they are in favor of stopping the war immediately without any conditions. So this is a very important and major shift. And it's very interesting. It's taking place right now when we are talking. And to make things even more interesting, I think it's important to point to the fact that most Russians before recently didn't care about the war. So it's not that they supported the war and then started opposing the war. No, they didn't care about the war, and they often didn't even know about the war, because special military operation is not a war. It's something which is happening somewhere far away, and we have nothing to do with it. Now, on the one hand, Russian society is getting awareness of the very fact of the war. And at the same time, the anti-war sentiment is increasing while the anti-war movement is decreasing. This is another interesting thing, because the anti-war movement just is exhausted. Just people who were struggling against the war, they are many of them are repressed. Many of them are exhausted physically and morally, but at the same time, the opposition to the war among the society is increasing. So it's a very interesting contradiction.
Okay, so I want to end this now and do another one with you very soon where we explore this further, because there's an interesting thing happening in the West now. If you watch the news here, most of the news is how resilient the Russian economy has been, how Russia can sustain this war for a long time, and how Western Europe, let me finish, how Western Europe is actually suffering and the recession is being caused by. A lot of the news here seems to be preparing public opinion for a negotiated settlement in Ukraine. And so in the next segment with you, let's explore both the economic side of this issue and what are the prospects for some kind of peaceful resolution here? Because it seems, at least my view is, I couldn't care less what territory ends up in which oligarch's hands. I think people need to stop dying here. But anyway, thanks very much. And let's do this again.
Absolutely.
Okay. And thank you for joining us on theAnalysis.news.